Chapter 1. The Invitation. The mist came early to St. Mary Mead that autumn, curling low over the hedgerows like something reluctant to leave, and it was in this hour, the hour when the village seemed suspended between night and day, between memory and forgetting, that Eleanor Voss sat down at her writing desk and began the last correspondence of her life. She did not know it was the last, of course. Or perhaps in some quiet chamber of herself she no longer visited often. She did. Larkspur Cottage stood at the far end of the lane, past the church and the yew trees and the little stone bridge, where children still occasionally lost their balls to the stream below, and it had always struck the village as a house too large for a woman who lived so entirely alone. Eleanor had returned to it 8 months prior, after decades away, first as a schoolmistress in Kent, then, some said, abroad, and the village had absorbed her return the way it absorbed all things eventually, with polite curiosity, a flurry of tea-table speculation, and then gradually a kind of forgetting. She kept to herself. She tended her garden with a precision that unsettled the more sentimental gardeners of the parish. She was, by all appearances, simply an old woman come home to grow old more quietly. But on this particular morning, her hands were not steady. She wrote 5 letters, each in the same careful, looping script, each addressed to a name the village would have recognized without surprise, for they were, none of them, strangers to St. Mary Mead, nor to each other, nor, though none of them would have said so aloud, to a summer 30 years gone that none of them had spoken of since. She wrote Colonel Gerald Pembridge with a hand that did not waver, though something in her chest did, briefly, like a bird startled from a hedge. She wrote Reverend Aldous Finch, and paused only to look, for a long moment, at the small brass crucifix on her mantel. She wrote Diana Holt and Tom Bristow, and a 5th name that would matter less, in the end, than the 4 that came before it. Each letter said the same simple thing. Tea, Thursday next, 4 o'clock, at Larkspur Cottage. There is a matter I should like, at last, to set right. She sealed them with a steadiness that surprised her, and walked them herself to the post office on the green, where Mrs. Latimer behind the counter remarked, not unkindly, that Miss Voss looked rather pale that morning, and wasn't the air turning cold early this year, and Eleanor had smiled in the particular way of a woman keeping something folded very small and very tight beneath her ribs, and agreed that yes, it was. It was Miss Jane Marple, taking her habitual walk past the green with a basket of wool over one arm, ostensibly bound for nothing more sinister than the wool shop, who observed the small transaction through the post office window, and who noted, as she noted most things, without quite meaning to, the way some women notice a stitch dropped 3 rows back, that Eleanor Voss's hand had trembled very slightly as she passed the letters across the counter, though her face had not. Miss Marple did not think a great deal of it at the time. One did not, after all, make a habit of reading tragedy into every unsteady hand in a village full of arthritic old ladies and nervous young men. And yet something about the particular quality of that tremor, not the shake of age, but the finer, tighter tremor of a decision long deferred and finally made, lodged itself somewhere in her memory, the way a single wrong note lodges in the ear of a woman who has played the piano her whole life and cannot say precisely why it troubles her, only that it does. That evening, as the light failed early and the mist thickened along the lane once more, Eleanor Voss sat alone in her drawing room and did something curious. She took down from the cabinet a set of 6 china cups, her mother's, painted with small blue forget-me-nots, kept for occasions that had in recent years rarely come, and set them out upon the table with the slow, ceremonial care of a woman laying flowers on a grave. 5 for her guests, and 1 more, set slightly apart from the others, at the head of the table, though she had told no one, and would tell no one, who it was meant for. She stood back and regarded the table for a long while in the gathering dark, her reflection faint and doubled in the black window glass behind her, and something crossed her face then that no one, not Mrs. Latimer, not the vicar, not even Miss Marple, walking home at that same hour beneath a sky closing over with cloud, was there to see. Then she went to the small writing desk in the corner, drew out a single sheet of paper, and began, with hands that would not quite be still, a letter she did not send. When she had finished it, she folded it once, twice, and locked it away in the bottom drawer of her desk, the drawer whose small brass key she wore, from that evening forward, on a ribbon about her throat, as though it were something far too precious or far too dangerous to ever let out of her sight again. Chapter 2. An Empty Chair. Thursday arrived with a thin, colorless sun that did little to warm the lane leading to Larkspur Cottage, and by 10 minutes to 4, the 5 guests had begun to converge upon it from their separate directions, each moving with the particular reluctance of people who have accepted an invitation they would very much rather have declined. Colonel Pembridge came first, as befitted a man for whom punctuality was less a courtesy than a moral position. He walked with his customary upright bearing, his silver-topped cane tapping the lane in an unhurried rhythm, and he paused at the cottage gate to remove his hat and smooth what remained of his hair, a gesture so habitual it seemed less vanity than ritual, the small armor a man puts on before entering any room. From her own garden 2 doors down, where she was ostensibly occupied with a recalcitrant rosebush, Miss Marple observed that he stood at that gate a full 10 seconds longer than the act required, and that his gaze, in that interval, went not to the cottage door, but to the drawing-room window, as though he were counting something behind the glass. Diana Holt arrived next, on foot from the direction of the village, her coat a fraction too fashionable for the lane's muddy verges, her expression composed into the bright, brittle pleasantness of a woman who has rehearsed her face in a mirror before leaving the house. She greeted the colonel with the exact correct measure of warmth, and Miss Marple, who had known a great many young women in financial difficulty over the years, and had learned to recognize the particular tightness around the eyes that no amount of powder quite disguised, noted that Diana's glance went, quite involuntarily, to the cottage itself, appraising it in the manner of someone doing silent arithmetic. The Reverend Aldous Finch came by bicycle, dismounting rather too briskly at the gate, his collar slightly askew, his color high in a way that owed nothing to the exercise. He greeted the others with the automatic geniality of his profession. But Miss Marple, watching still from behind her rose bush with the unhurried patience of a woman who had learned that most human truths reveal themselves only to those willing to wait for them, saw his hand go twice to his waistcoat pocket and twice come away empty, as though searching for something he had decided, at the last moment, not to bring. Tom Bristow, Eleanor's gardener, arrived last, and most reluctantly of all, still in his working clothes, his cap twisted in both hands, glancing up and down the lane before he approached the gate at all, in the manner of a man checking whether he is observed, which of course he was. The fifth guest, a quiet, colorless woman named Harriet Vane, a distant cousin of no particular consequence to this account, though she would sit through the coming hour with the anxious stillness of a woman who wished herself elsewhere, completed the party, and together the five of them were shown into Eleanor's drawing room by her housekeeper, Mrs. Ede, who informed them, with the faint apology of a woman unused to hosting, that Miss Voss would be down directly. She was not down directly. The clock on the mantel, a heavy, deliberate thing, its ticking unusually loud in a room otherwise filled with the small, effortful sounds of five people making conversation they did not wish to make, moved past 4 o'clock, and then past 10 minutes after, and the talk in the room, which had begun as the ordinary currency of village life, the weather and the church roof fund and Mrs. Latimer's rheumatism, began to fray at its edges, the pauses between remarks growing longer, the smiles growing more effortful to sustain. It was Miss Marple arriving fashionably, and, she would later reflect, providentially late, who was shown into the room at 1/4 the hour, and who registered, in the single unhurried sweep of a glance that seemed to take in nothing in particular, and in fact took in everything, the precise temperature of the silence she had walked into. The colonel stood near the window with his hands clasped behind his back in the posture of a man reviewing troops, his face arranged into patient good humor, though his knuckles, she noted, were rather too white for patience. Diana Holt sat with her tea untouched, her eyes flicking repeatedly to the door. The Reverend had begun, quite unconsciously, to twist his signet ring round and round upon his finger. Tom Bristow stood rather than sat, as though poised to leave at the first excuse. Only Harriet Vane seemed genuinely puzzled rather than afraid, glancing between the others with the mild bewilderment of someone who has wandered into a play whose earlier acts she has missed entirely. "I do hope nothing is wrong," Miss Marple said, settling herself into the chair nearest the cold hearth, with the unhurried comfort of a woman for whom sitting down was itself a small art. Eleanor is not usually a woman to keep people waiting. She was always rather particular about that, even as a girl. It was the colonel who answered, his voice carrying its habitual warmth, though Miss Marple thought, and would think of it again, many days later, in a very different room, that the warmth sat upon his words that afternoon like frost upon a window pane, bright, but not the true color of the glass beneath. "No doubt she has simply lost track of the hour," he said. "Ladies of a certain age, you understand, Miss Marple, though I dare say you'd forgive me the observation better than most. It was meant, perhaps, as a small gallantry, the kind of remark that oils the wheels of an uncomfortable silence. But Miss Marple, watching him say it, found herself thinking, not for any reason she could yet have named, only that some old instinct, tuned over 60 years of watching human faces do what human faces do when they are frightened, had quietly sounded its alarm, that a man entirely at ease does not so carefully choose his words. It was Mrs. Ede who broke the impasse at last, returning after 20 further minutes of increasingly strained conversation, to say with the particular anxious formality of servants unused to delivering bad news, that she had knocked twice upon the study door and received no answer, and that the door, moreover, appeared to be locked from within, which was, she added, rather unusual, as Miss Voss did not, to her knowledge, generally lock that door at all. The 5 guests rose together in the sudden, wordless unity of people who have each, privately, been dreading precisely this moment since they first stepped through the garden gate, and Miss Marple rose with them, more slowly, her eyes moving once more across each face in turn. The Colonel's studied calm, Diana's sharpening fear, the Reverend's pallor, Tom's stillness, Harriet's honest confusion, cataloguing each expression with the quiet, involuntary precision of a woman who could not have stopped herself doing so, even had she wished to. They went together down the narrow passage to the study door, their footsteps oddly loud upon the bare boards, and it was Colonel Pembridge who reached it first and set his shoulder to it, and Miss Marple who stood nearest the handle as it gave way beneath his weight with a splintering crack that seemed, in that hushed house, as loud as a gunshot, and beyond it, in the failing afternoon light, there was no sound at all. No voice, no movement, only a silence so complete, so absolute, that Miss Marple felt it settle over the little group like something cold laid across the back of the neck, and knew, before a single one of them had stepped across the threshold, precisely what manner of silence it was. Chapter 3. The Sixth Cup. Eleanor Voss was found seated at her own desk, in the attitude of a woman who had simply grown tired midway through a task and closed her eyes to rest, save that her spectacles had slipped to the floor beside her chair, and that the pen had rolled from her fingers to lie in a small dark stain upon the blotter, and that no amount of gentle fiction could quite account for the particular stillness of a body from which life has entirely departed. It was Tom Bristow who made a low, wordless sound and turned away first, his cap still crushed in both hands. Harriet Vane, who pressed her fingers to her mouth. The Reverend, who murmured something under his breath that was not quite a prayer and not quite anything else. Diana Holt stood very white and very still in the doorway, as though her feet had simply stopped obeying her. And Colonel Pembridge, Miss Marple noted this with the same quiet, unwilled attention she had given everything else that afternoon, stepped forward into the room ahead of the others, not from any particular urgency to help, for there was plainly no help to be given, but with the measured, deliberate gait of a man walking into a space he wished, for reasons of his own, to see first and thoroughly. The study itself was a small, close room, lined with books Eleanor had collected across a lifetime of teaching, and it retained still the ordinary smell of any well-kept room: beeswax, old paper, the faint sweetness of the chrysanthemums in the vase upon the sill, beneath which, so faint that Miss Marple would not have trusted her own nose had she not spent 60 years trusting precisely such small, faint things, there lingered something else, with a thread of tobacco smoke, sweetish and dark, of a kind that did not belong in a room whose owner had never, in all the years Miss Marple had known her, permitted smoking in her presence. It was young Constable Palk, summoned by Mrs. Eade's frantic telephone call, who arrived first from the village, and Inspector Slack, a large, brisk man who had built a satisfactory career upon the conviction that most mysteries were considerably less mysterious than sentimental old women wish them to be, who arrived some 3/4 of an hour later, by which time the light had failed entirely and the study was lit by 2 unsteady oil lamps that threw everyone's shadow long and strange across the bookshelves. Inspector Slack surveyed the room with the confident economy of a man who had already, before crossing the threshold, arrived at his conclusion. "Heart, most likely," he pronounced, after the briefest possible examination, "or else a stroke. Ladies of that age, living alone, it happens more often than you'd think, and generally there's no more mystery to it than that." He glanced, not unkindly, but with a certain professional impatience, toward Miss Marple, who stood near the door with her hands folded before her, and an expression of such mild, elderly vagueness that a less experienced observer of village life might have mistaken it for simple confusion. "No need for alarm, ladies and gentlemen. These things are sad, but they are not, generally speaking, sinister." It was, Miss Marple reflected afterward, precisely the sort of pronouncement that Inspector Slack most enjoyed making, and precisely the sort that circumstances most enjoyed proving wrong. She said nothing of this at the time, however. She had learned, across a great many years and a great many rooms not unlike this one, that the moment to speak was very rarely the moment when speaking would do the most good, and that a woman past 70, dressed in soft gray wool, and possessed of a face that suggested nothing more alarming than an interest in bird-watching, could observe a very great deal simply by being underestimated. And so she moved, with the unhurried, apparently aimless drift of an old lady at loose ends in an unfamiliar house, toward the small tea-table that had been laid, that morning, in the drawing-room beyond. For Mrs. Eade had mentioned, in her flustered account to the constable, that Miss Voss had asked for tea-things to be set out early, quite unusually early, and had seen to the arrangement herself. The 6 cups stood exactly where Eleanor had left them the evening before. Her mother's china, the small blue forget-me-nots faded with age, 5 arranged in their ordinary places about the table, and the 6th, Miss Marple paused over this one for a long moment, her expression giving away nothing at all, set slightly apart, at the head of the table, its handle turned inward toward the chair, rather than outward toward where a guest's hand might naturally fall. It was a small thing, it was. To any other eye in that house, nothing at all. The idle arrangement of an old woman's tea-things, unremarkable, forgettable, already halfway toward being cleared away by a housekeeper with far graver matters on her mind. But Miss Marple had poured tea for other people and had tea poured for her, across the whole long span of an English life in which such small rituals had their own exact and unspoken grammar, and she knew, with the calm, wordless certainty of long habit, that no woman who had spent a lifetime setting tables correctly would turn a single cup's handle the wrong way by accident. Eleanor Voss, who did nothing without a reason, had turned that cup inward on purpose. She had set it, quite deliberately, not for a guest to drink from at all, but for someone, Miss Marple did not yet know who, though she suspected, with a small cold certainty she did not care to examine too closely, that it was Eleanor herself who had meant to sit in that chair, facing that cup, when whatever she had planned for that afternoon came finally to pass. She was still considering this when her eye fell upon the study grate, visible through the open door beyond, where a small fire had burned down to ash, and one curled, blackened fragment of paper had escaped the flames to lodge against the fender, singed at its edges but not entirely consumed. No one else in the room was looking in that direction. Inspector Slack was occupied with his notebook, the colonel in low, grave conversation with the Reverend, Diana Holt still standing white and motionless by the window. Miss Marple crossed the room with the unremarkable, shuffling gait of an old woman steadying herself against the furniture, and in the single, unhurried movement of a hand reaching to straighten a fallen fire iron, she closed her fingers about the scrap of burnt paper and drew it, quite unseen, into the folds of her gray wool sleeve. She did not look at it there, in that room, with so many eyes that might, however distractedly, have turned toward her. She waited until she was home again, in the small quiet of her own sitting room, with the curtains drawn and the lamp lit, before she smoothed the fragment flat upon her writing desk and studied, in the loping, familiar hand she recognized at once as Eleanor's own, the 4 words that had survived the fire, words that would not, in the days that followed, leave her thoughts for very long at all. Forgive him, before it. Chapter 4. Old Ghosts of St. Mary Mead. The village, in the days that followed, settled upon its own comfortable version of events, with the speed and thoroughness peculiar to small places accustomed to managing their own griefs. Eleanor Voss had died of a weak heart, or a stroke, or simply of old age arriving somewhat before its time. The doctor's certificate, when it came, spoke in the vague, unobjectionable language such certificates generally favor, and Inspector Slack, satisfied that no further inquiry was required, returned his attention to matters he considered more properly criminal, a spate of poultry thefts in the neighboring parish chief among them. Miss Marple, for her part, said nothing to disturb this comfortable settlement. She attended the funeral, a small and correctly mournful affair at St. Mary's, and she noted, with the same unhurried attention she brought to everything, that Colonel Pembridge read the lesson in a voice that did not once falter, that Diana Holt wept with what appeared to be genuine, if complicated, feeling that the Reverend Finch conducted the service with a pallor that owed nothing to the weather, and that Tom Bristow stood at the very back of the church, near the door, in the posture of a man prepared to leave at any moment. The service should require something more of him than his presence. It was not, however, the funeral itself that occupied Miss Marple's thoughts in the weeks that followed. so much as the 4 words she had smoothed flat upon her writing desk, and had since folded away in the small lacquered box where she kept those few things: a pressed flower, a photograph, a child's letter long treasured, that meant rather more to her than their appearance would suggest. Forgive him, before it what? Before it was too late, perhaps. Before some other, graver thing occurred. Or perhaps, and this thought troubled her more than she cared to admit, before she did something she could not afterward undo. And so Miss Marple did what she had always done best, and what the village, in its comfortable underestimation of elderly ladies with an interest in gardens and gossip, permitted her to do without the least suspicion of her purpose. She began, gently and without apparent design, to talk. She talked to Mrs. Latimer at the post office, ostensibly about stamps, and learned that Eleanor Voss had, in the months before her death, made several visits to the parish records office, always alone, always brief, and had once left in what Mrs. Latimer, with the relish of a woman recalling a delicious small scandal, described as quite a state, though she covered it well, being the sort who would. She talked to old Mr. Hartley, who had kept the village shop for 50 years and remembered, when pressed with the patient, circling questions Miss Marple had long ago perfected, a summer some 30 years past when a girl named Margaret Ashe had drowned in the mill pond behind the old Ashe farm. A sad business, he said, shaking his head, though his eyes had grown suddenly evasive in a way that told Miss Marple he remembered rather more of it than he cared to say. It was from Miss Weatherby, an elderly spinster of Miss Marple's own generation, whose memory for village history was matched only by her appetite for recounting it, that she gathered the fullest, if still incomplete, account. Margaret Ashe had been 15, the youngest daughter of a farming family since moved away, and had drowned one August evening in circumstances that had never, in Miss Weatherby's recollection, been entirely satisfactorily explained. There had been a group of young people about that summer, quite the little set, my dear, though I never cared for the way they carried on, among whom Miss Weatherby named, with the casual precision of a woman who had simply never forgotten, a young Gerald Pembridge, newly commissioned and thought rather dashing, a young Eleanor Voss herself, freshly returned from Teachers' College, and 2 or 3 others whose names had faded from the village's memory along with their faces. They said it was an accident, Miss Weatherby said, pouring out a second cup of tea with the unhurried satisfaction of a woman enjoying an audience. The Ashe family never disputed it, though I always did think, at the time, that they looked rather too quickly satisfied for people who'd lost a daughter. But there, one doesn't like to speak ill of the departed, or of the bereaved, and it was all so very long ago now. Miss Marple thanked her, and walked home through a lane already darkening with the early dusk of late autumn, turning the fragments of the afternoon over in her mind with the slow, careful attention she gave to any pattern not yet fully formed. A girl drowned 30 years past. A woman who had spent those 30 years away from the village, and who had returned, at last, to make private and unexplained visits to the parish records. A burnt letter that spoke of forgiveness, and of something that must happen before some unnamed and evidently dreaded event. 5 guests summoned to tea, each of an age to have known Margaret Ashe, each betraying, in that locked and airless drawing room, a fear too specific to be mere sympathy for a hostess who had failed to appear. She was still turning these thoughts over, unresolved, when she came upon old Mrs. Ketterick sitting at her cottage gate in the last gray light, wrapped in her shawl as she was most fine evenings, watching the lane with the placid, inexhaustible patience of the very old. Mrs. Ketterick had known every family in St. Mary Mead for the better part of 80 years, and it was to her, on impulse, that Miss Marple paused to mention, in the most idle and roundabout way she could manage, the sad business of poor Eleanor Voss, and the sadder, older business of the Ashe girl so long ago now. Mrs. Ketterick was quiet for a long moment, her pale eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance that had, perhaps, nothing at all to do with the lane before her. When she spoke at last, her voice had dropped to the low, private register of a woman sharing something she had carried a very long time, and had perhaps been waiting, without quite knowing it, for someone to finally ask. "Some debts don't die, my dear," she said. "They only wait for someone brave enough to collect them." She turned her head then and looked at Miss Marple with an expression that was not quite a warning and not quite an accusation, but something adjacent to both. "I always did wonder what became of that brave one when she finally came home to do it." Chapter 5. 5 Strangers, 1 Secret. It was not, Miss Marple reflected, a difficult thing to call upon 5 people in the space of a single week without arousing the least suspicion of purpose. A village the size of St. Mary Mead ran, after all, on precisely such visits: the borrowed pattern for a jumper, the enquiry after a sickly aunt, the small parcel of jam that must be delivered in person or not at all, and an elderly woman moving from cottage to cottage with a basket over her arm excited no more comment than the weather. She had done it in one form or another for the better part of 40 years, and if she now did it with a rather more particular purpose in mind, there was no one in the village likely to remark upon it. She began with Diana Holt, whom she found in the small rented rooms above the chemist's shop that Diana had occupied since her return to the village some months before, rooms that spoke, in their careful, threadbare tidiness, of a woman keeping up appearances on considerably less than appearances required. Diana received her with the same bright, effortful warmth she had shown at the tea table, offering a cup of indifferent tea and a plate of biscuits Miss Marple suspected had been bought specially, and it took very little steering of the conversation before Diana was speaking, with the particular relief of the genuinely unburdened, of her hopes regarding Eleanor's will. "She'd always said the cottage would come to me," Diana said, turning her cup round and round in its saucer without drinking from it. "There's no one else, you see, no closer family left. I don't mind admitting I'd rather hoped." She stopped, coloring faintly. "That sounds dreadful, doesn't it, with poor Eleanor scarcely in the ground?" "Not dreadful at all, my dear," Miss Marple said, with the particular gentleness she reserved for young people confessing to ordinary human wants. "Merely honest. It is only dishonesty that need trouble us. She watched Diana's face carefully as she said it, and saw relief pass over it like sun through cloud. The relief, Miss Marple judged, of a woman whose guilt ran to forged expectations and desperate arithmetic, and no further than that. There was fear in the girl, certainly, but it was the ordinary fear of debt and diminished prospects, not the deeper, colder fear of discovery that Miss Marple had seen, however briefly, cross another face in that locked drawing room. The Reverend Finch proved a more delicate visit. She found him in the vestry, ostensibly occupied with the following Sunday's hymn selections, and it was some time before she coaxed from him, in halting, shame-faced fragments, the nature of what troubled him, not murder, as it transpired, but a private and long-fought battle with drink that he had believed himself, until recently, to have won, and had lately begun, in the strain of Eleanor's death and its unwelcome disturbance of old memories, to lose again, in small and secret increments. "I am not proud of it, Miss Marple," he said, his hands, she noted, trembling in exactly the manner she had observed at the tea-table, though for reasons that had nothing whatever to do with murder. "But I did not harm her, whatever else you may think of me." Tom Bristow she found in Eleanor's own garden, still tending it out of some obscure loyalty or habit, and he answered her careful questions with the wary monosyllables of a man expecting, at every turn, to be accused of something. It was only when she mentioned, almost idly, a small discrepancy in the household accounts Mrs. Ede had shown her, a discrepancy Miss Marple had, in truth, invented on the spot, though Tom could not have known this, that his composure broke entirely, and he confessed, white-faced, to a small theft of garden tools sold on to a dealer in the next town, a petty meanness he had been terrified Eleanor had somehow discovered and meant to expose. "I never touched her, ma'am," he said, twisting his cap in both hands as he had twisted it at the gate. "I'd not have dared, but I was afraid she knew. God help me, I was glad, when I heard she'd gone, that it need never come out." He looked, saying it, thoroughly ashamed of himself, and thoroughly, unmistakably innocent of anything graver. It was Harriet Vane who proved, in the end, to have the least to hide, a distant, unremarkable cousin who had known Eleanor only slightly, invited to the tea, she confessed with some bewilderment, for reasons she had never fully understood and could not now ask about. Miss Marple came away from that interview satisfied that Harriet's presence on the guest list had been, if anything, a kind of camouflage, a fifth chair to disguise the true and narrower purpose of the other four. It was the Colonel, called upon last, who gave her the most to consider, though he gave her, in the way of conversation, almost nothing at all. She found him in his study at Ashgrove House, a room of considerable comfort and considerable order, its walls hung with the modest decorations of a respectable military career and the framed certificates of a lifetime's charitable service, and he received her with the same warm, paternal courtesy he had shown at every previous encounter, pressing sherry upon her, inquiring after her garden, expressing in tones of measured sorrow his continued distress over poor Eleanor's passing. "A dreadful business," he said, settling into the chair opposite her own, with the easy comfort of a man entirely at his leisure. One doesn't like to dwell upon it, Miss Marple, but I confess I've found it difficult to think of much else. She was a fine woman. We none of us appreciate, I think, how much the past stays with us, until something of this kind reminds us rather forcibly. It was, on its surface, an unremarkable remark, the sort of gentle philosophizing any elderly gentleman might offer over a glass of sherry on a gray afternoon. And yet Miss Marple, watching him say it, found herself struck by a small, precise wrongness she could not at first name, and did not fully understand until she had left Ashgrove House and was some way down the lane toward home, the early dusk gathering once more about the hedgerows. It was not what the Colonel had said. It was the stillness with which he had said it, the same complete, deliberate composure he had worn in the drawing-room while 5 other people trembled and wept and twisted their hands, the composure of a man who had, she now understood with sudden and unwelcome clarity, no need whatever to search his memory for what he felt about Eleanor Voss's death, because he had never for one moment stopped thinking of it. Every other soul in that room, she realized, had been frightened of what might yet be discovered. The Colonel alone had spoken already, calmly, generously, as a man speaks of a grief already fully known and fully priced, and it was that, more than any tremor or evasion, that told Miss Marple, walking home alone through the darkening lane with her basket forgotten upon her arm, that the calmest man in the room was the only one among them who had known, before anyone else in that house so much as suspected it, exactly what lay behind Eleanor Voss's locked door. Chapter 6. The Mill Pond Path. The old mill pond lay some quarter-mile beyond the last cottages of the village, reached by a footpath that had, in Miss Marple's girlhood, been kept clear and well-trodden by farm children on their way to and from the ashland, and had since grown over with the slow, patient reclamation that unused paths in the English countryside always eventually undergo, brambles closing in from either hedge, the way narrowing year upon year until only the faintest suggestion of a track remained, visible more by the memory of where it had once run than by any mark still upon the ground. Miss Marple walked it on a gray Tuesday morning, ostensibly in search of a particular variety of wild fungus she had heard grew thereabouts, though she carried, in the pocket of her tweed coat, rather more purpose than her basket suggested. The pond itself, when she reached it, proved smaller and less menacing than 3 decades of village memory had perhaps painted it, a still, dark sheet of water fringed with reeds and the leaning remains of the old mill wheel, silent now but for the occasional plop of some unseen creature disturbing its surface, and altogether too ordinary and too peaceful a place, she thought, standing at its edge, to have swallowed a 15-year-old girl one August evening 30 years before. It was at the water's edge, half hidden beneath the drooping fronds of a willow that had grown considerably since Miss Marple had last had occasion to walk this path, that she found what she had, in some unacknowledged corner of her mind, half expected to find, a small posy of flowers, wilted but not yet entirely dead, laid with evident care upon a patch of ground that showed, beneath her closer inspection, the unmistakable signs of having been disturbed and tended more than once. The soil turned and resettled in the particular way of a spot visited regularly rather than once. There was no marker, no stone, nothing that any casual walker would have recognized as a grave, for it was not, of course, a grave in any formal sense. Only the place, Miss Marple understood with a small, cold certainty, where a girl had last been seen alive, and where someone, for reasons she was only now beginning fully to grasp, had continued for years to bring flowers in private and unwitnessed grief. She crouched, with rather more effort than she would have liked to admit, and examined the posy more closely, and found among the wilted stems a small folded scrap of paper, rain-softened and half illegible, upon which only a handful of words remained legible in a hand she recognized at once as Eleanor's own. "Still watching over you, my dear, until I can at last—" The sentence, like so much else in this business, ended before it could tell her what she most wished to know. It was on her way back through the village, turning the fragment over in her mind, that Miss Marple paused at the church, drawn by an impulse she could not entirely have explained, and found old Mr. Diggory, the sexton, occupied with the slow, unhurried business of trimming the yew hedge along the churchyard wall. Mr. Diggory had held his post for the better part of 40 years, and possessed, in consequence, a memory for parish records that considerably exceeded his enthusiasm for discussing them. But Miss Marple had known him a very long time, and it took only the gentlest coaxing, a remark about the Ashe family, long since moved away, and whether their old plot in the churchyard was still tended, to loosen his tongue. "Curious thing that," he said, leaning on his shears with the satisfaction of a man glad of an excuse to pause in his work. "The Ashe girl's not buried here at all, if you want the truth of it. Buried over Kingsbridge way, where the family removed to not long after, but there's an entry in the old parish register all the same, from that summer, that never did sit quite right with me." He straightened, wiping his brow with the back of one weathered hand. Vicar before Reverend Finch, old Mr. Aldercott, this would have been, long retired now, God rest him, recorded the death as accidental drowning. No question raised, though I do recall there was some manner of correction made to the entry not long after. A line struck through and rewritten in a different hand than the rest of the page. Miss Marple's interest, though her expression betrayed nothing more than the mild curiosity of an old woman fond of local history, sharpened considerably at this. "A different hand, Mr. Diggory? Do you recall whose?" The sexton considered this for a long moment, scratching at his chin. "Couldn't say for certain, not after all these years, but I do recall it was a neat hand, a school-teacher's hand, I always thought, though I never had cause to think much more of it than that." He shrugged, returning his attention to the hedge. "Old business, Miss Marple. Best left where it lies, if you ask me." But Miss Marple, walking home that afternoon with the light already beginning to fail and a fine, cold drizzle beginning to fall, found she could not so easily leave it where it lay, for something in the sexton's description, a neat hand, a school-teacher's hand, correcting a parish record in the very summer of Margaret Ash's death, had stirred a memory of her own, one she could not at first place, until she was very nearly at her own garden gate, and the recollection arrived with the sudden, complete clarity of a photograph developing in solution. She had seen that hand before, not 30 years past, in some faded parish register she had never laid eyes upon, but recently, within the past fortnight in fact, in the tidy, meticulous columns of a very different document entirely. The parish charity ledger, which she had examined only days before at the vicarage, in the course of an entirely unrelated errand concerning the church roof fund, and in which she had noted, with only passing interest at the time, an unusually large anonymous donation made to the small scholarship fund established, some years before, in the name of the Ash family's youngest daughter. The entry recording that donation had been made, she now recalled with perfect and unwelcome certainty, in the same neat, careful, unmistakable hand as every other entry in that ledger for the better part of 2 decades, the hand of the man who had served, without interruption and without exception, as the parish's honorary treasurer since long before Miss Marple herself had troubled to notice, Colonel Gerald Pembridge. She stood quite still at her own gate for a long moment, the cold drizzle settling unnoticed upon her shoulders, while the small, disparate pieces she had gathered across so many quiet afternoons, a burnt letter, a misturned cup, a scent of tobacco where none should have been, a flower laid in secret at a mill-pond's edge, and now this, a hand that had, it seemed, been quietly correcting the record of Margaret Ash's death for longer than Miss Marple had yet allowed herself to fully consider, arranged themselves, with the terrible, quiet inevitability of a pattern too long resisted, into a shape she found she could no longer pretend not to see. Chapter 7. The Anonymous Donor. The vicarage on a wet Wednesday afternoon was a place of dim, comfortable clutter, its study lined floor to ceiling with the accumulated paperwork of some 4 decades of parish administration, and it was here, ostensibly to review the wording of a notice for the church roof fund, that Miss Marple returned 2 days later to examine, at greater and more deliberate leisure than her first passing glance had allowed, the ledger she now understood to matter a very great deal more than any question of slate or guttering. Reverend Finch, still pale and rather more subdued than his usual pulpit manner suggested, left her alone with the account books with the distracted gratitude of a man glad of any excuse to be elsewhere, and Miss Marple settled herself at his desk with her spectacles perched upon her nose and turned, with the patient, unhurried thoroughness of a woman who had spent a lifetime finding significance in columns of figures other people found merely tedious, to the entries recording the small charitable trust established some 11 years before in memory of Margaret Ash. The fund was modest by most measures, a scholarship, renewed annually, that sent some deserving village child on to the grammar school at Kingsbridge, its capital built up over the years through the ordinary small mercies of harvest collections and jumble sales, and the occasional legacy left by a departed parishioner with a fondness for the Ash name. But there entered some 8 months previous, in the very week, Miss Marple noted with a small, cold precision, that Eleanor Voss had first returned to St. Mary Mead stood a donation of considerably greater size than any that had preceded it, recorded simply as anonymous per Col G. Pembridge Honorable Treasurer, in the same neat, unhurried hand that filled every other line of the ledger for pages before and after. She sat for some time with the book open before her, turning the matter over with the particular care she gave to any fact that might, upon closer examination, prove to mean either a very great deal or almost nothing at all. A generous donation, made anonymously, was not itself a strange thing. The colonel was known throughout the parish for exactly such quiet, unpublicized generosities, his name attached to the church roof, the village hall's new windows, the annual Christmas hamper fund for the poorer cottages along Milk Lane, a lifetime's charity so consistent, so seemingly effortless, that the village had long ago stopped remarking upon it at all, the way one stops remarking upon the weather being generally mild in an English June. It was, Miss Marple reflected, precisely the kind of goodness that asked nothing of anyone's attention, and received, in consequence, rather less scrutiny than perhaps it ought. But timing, she had learned across a very long life of watching human behavior arrange itself into patterns, was rarely so innocent as it first appeared. A man who had given quietly and steadily to 100 small causes for 30 years does not, without some particular pressure upon his conscience, suddenly enlarge a single scholarship fund by a sum considerably exceeding his usual generosity, in the very week that the one woman who had shared his silence for 3 decades came home at last to break it. It was that evening at the autumn charity supper held in the village hall in aid of the very roof fund that had first occasioned her visit to the vicarage that Miss Marple found herself seated, by the ordinary accident of the table arrangements, almost directly across from Colonel Pembridge, and had occasion to observe him at rather greater length than any previous encounter had allowed. He was, that evening, entirely himself, warm, attentive, generous with his conversation, moving easily among the trestle tables to press second helpings upon reluctant children and inquire after elderly widows' health with a solicitude that seemed, to every eye but Miss Marple's, entirely unforced. He knelt at one point to help a small boy retrieve a dropped fork from beneath the table, and rose with the boy laughing delightedly at some private joke between them, and the sight of it, the colonel's easy, genuine warmth with the child, his patient, unhurried kindness in a room full of people who plainly adored him for exactly this quality, struck Miss Marple with a sudden and unexpected force that she found, for a long moment, almost impossible to name. For she did not doubt, watching him, that the kindness was real. That was, she understood with a chill that had nothing to do with the draughty hall, precisely what troubled her. She had expected, if her suspicions proved founded, to find beneath the colonel's respectable exterior some detectable falseness, a performance, however skillful, that a sufficiently patient eye might eventually catch faltering. But there was no falseness in him that she could find, watching him laugh with the child, watching him listen with genuine attention to old Mrs. Pruitt's complaints about her hip, watching him move through that hall as a man entirely, unimpeachably good. And it came to her then, with the particular quiet clarity that arrived, in her experience, only after long and patient watching, that this was not a mask laid over something else. It was rather the whole edifice a man might build, brick upon careful brick across 30 patient years, when he could not bear to look directly at what lay beneath it, not concealment so much as substitution, an entire lifetime of genuine goodness offered up, again and again, in the silent, unspoken hope that enough of it, given generously enough and often enough, might at last outweigh some single unbearable thing he had never once permitted himself to examine in the light. She thought of the burnt fragment locked away in her lacquered box, "Forgive him," before it. She thought of the flowers at the mill pond's edge, and the schoolteacher's hand correcting a parish register 30 years gone, and the anonymous gift entered in the very week Eleanor Voss came home. And she thought, watching Colonel Pembridge cross the hall once more to press a shilling into a delighted child's palm with a warmth that could not, she now understood, be counterfeited, that she was not looking at a man who had built a lifetime of charity to hide his guilt from the village. She was looking at a man who had built it to hide his guilt from himself, and who had very nearly succeeded, until Eleanor Voss came home and threatened, however gently, however lovingly, to take the whole careful edifice down. It was in that moment, watching him laugh once more with an ease that no longer looked to her like warmth at all, but like something far more desperate wearing warmth's familiar shape, that Miss Marple felt, for the first time in this whole quiet, patient business, something colder settle over her than mere suspicion, the unmistakable, unwelcome certainty of a woman who has finally seen, clearly and completely, the shape of a thing she had very much hoped, until that instant, she might still be wrong about. Chapter 8. The Burned Letter. It was some days before Miss Marple permitted herself to return, in the quiet of her own sitting room, to the small lacquered box, where the burnt fragment lay folded among the few other keepsakes she trusted with such things, for she had learned, across a long life of piecing together other people's secrets, that a clue examined too soon, before the mind had properly settled around it, often yielded less than the same clue returned to with patience, once the surrounding pattern had had time to grow clearer. And the pattern, she felt, turning the fragment over now beneath the lamplight with her spectacles pushed low upon her nose, had grown a very great deal clearer indeed. The paper itself told her little that was new. 4 words, charred at their edges, in Eleanor's own looping hand, "Forgive him," before it. But it was not the fragment alone that occupied her that evening. It was the second scrap, smaller still and so badly singed, she had very nearly overlooked it entirely in her first hurried examination of the study grate, which she now drew out from beneath the first and laid beside it upon the blotter, angling the lamp to catch what remained of the ink. She had assumed, that first evening, that the 2 fragments belonged to separate documents, so different was their condition, one merely singed, the other blackened almost past legibility. It was only now, holding them together beneath better light and with a clearer mind, that she saw they were, in fact, torn from the same page, and that the second fragment, painstakingly deciphered letter by letter across the better part of an hour, bore at its head the two words that transformed everything she had, until that moment, believed herself to understand. My dear Gerald. Miss Marple sat very still for a long moment, the lamp hissing faintly in the quiet room, and felt the whole shape of the matter shift beneath her, the way a familiar room seems suddenly unfamiliar when a single piece of furniture has been moved in the night. She had assumed, as she suspected, anyone would have assumed, presented with the bare facts of a woman gathering old associates for tea and speaking in a burnt fragment of forgiveness withheld and something dreaded, that Eleanor Voss had summoned Colonel Pembridge, along with the others, to force upon him some manner of reckoning, a confession extracted, a debt at last collected, precisely as old Mrs. Ketterick's cryptic remark had suggested. It was the shape the whole business had seemed, from the very first, most naturally to take, and Miss Marple, for all her patience, had allowed herself to settle rather more comfortably into that shape than she now realized. But a letter addressed my dear Gerald, in a hand that had, judging by the softened, rounded quality of certain letters, been written not in anger, but in something gentler, something that trembled not with accusation, but with a tenderness 30 years in the keeping, was not the letter of a woman preparing to expose an old and terrible secret out of anger, or even out of justice narrowly conceived. It was, Miss Marple understood with a small, sorrowful clarity, very possibly something else altogether, the letter of a woman who had carried her own share of that old guilt for 3 decades, and had come home, at the end of her life, not to punish an old friend for a sin they had once shared, but to offer him, at last, the one thing she suspected he had never permitted himself to accept, a hand extended, rather than a fist raised, that forgive him before it destroyed him, perhaps, before the guilt he had spent 30 years quietly starving himself against finally consumed whatever remained of the man beneath the goodness. Miss Marple thought again of the charity supper, of the colonel kneeling to retrieve a child's fork with such unforced warmth, of the whole vast, patient architecture of decency he had built across a lifetime, and thought, with a grief that surprised her in its sudden depth, that Eleanor Voss had perhaps understood him better, in the end, than anyone else alive, well enough to know that what he needed was not exposure, but release. Well enough perhaps to believe she alone could offer it to him gently, in the privacy of her own drawing-room, over tea poured from her mother's china, rather than see it dragged into the harsher light of formal confession and public shame. And if that was so, if Eleanor Voss had meant, on that quiet Thursday afternoon, not to threaten the colonel but to save him, then the 6 teacups laid out with such careful, deliberate ceremony took on a meaning Miss Marple had not, until this moment, allowed herself fully to consider. 5 for the guests who might, in time, need to know some version of the truth, and the 6th, set apart, handle turned inward, not for a stranger, and not even, perhaps, for Eleanor herself, but for the one guest she had hoped, above all others, to sit across from that afternoon, the man she had summoned, not to judge, but to forgive. Miss Marple removed her spectacles at last and pressed her fingers, for a long moment, against her closed eyes, feeling the particular, familiar weariness that came not from the solving of a puzzle, but from the growing certainty of what its solution would cost. For if Eleanor Voss had died attempting an act of mercy rather than an act of justice, then the man who had killed her had not silenced an accuser. He had silenced the one person in the whole of England most inclined to forgive him, and had done so, Miss Marple now understood, with a sorrow that sat very close beside her certainty, not out of calculation, but out of a terror so old and so carefully buried that even an offered mercy had come to look, to eyes that could no longer trust kindness in any form, exactly like a threat. It was very late by the time Miss Marple set the two fragments carefully aside and drew a fresh sheet of notepaper toward her, and later still, when she had finished the brief, carefully worded note she addressed the following morning to Colonel Gerald Pembridge, a note that mentioned nothing of burnt letters or millpond flowers or anonymous donations, but asked only, in the mildest and most unassuming terms she could contrive, whether he might spare her a quarter hour some afternoon soon, as she found herself rather puzzled over a small discrepancy in the parish meeting minutes for the Thursday in question, and wondered whether, as honorary treasurer, he might be so kind as to help her clear it up. She sealed the note and sat for a long while afterward, with her hands folded in her lap and the lamp burning low, aware, with the calm and terrible clarity of a woman who has asked a question she already suspects will not be answered gently, that she had just invited into her own quiet sitting-room a man who had, in all likelihood, already killed once to keep the very truth she now intended, as gently as she knew how, to finally bring into the light. Chapter 9. The Parish Minutes. The Colonel arrived at Miss Marple's cottage promptly at 3, as she had known he would, for punctuality was, in his case, less a courtesy than a kind of armor, and he came bearing a small bunch of late chrysanthemums from his own garden and an expression of such easy, unhurried goodwill that Miss Marple, opening the door to him, felt for one unsteady moment the full weight of what she was about to do to a man who had never, in all the years she had known him, been anything but kind to her. She showed him into her small sitting-room, where the fire had been lit against the afternoon's encroaching chill, and the tea things already stood ready upon the low table between them, an ordinary courtesy offered to an ordinary guest, though Miss Marple was aware, setting out the cups with hands that did not tremble, though something beneath her ribs certainly did, of how very much this small domestic ritual now resembled another tea-table in another drawing-room some weeks before. "You mentioned some confusion over the parish minutes," the Colonel said, settling into the chair she indicated with the same easy comfort he brought to every room he entered, accepting his cup with a small nod of thanks. "I confess I'm rather flattered to be consulted. Reverend Finch generally leaves such matters entirely to me, you know. I don't believe he's read the minute book in years." "It is a very small thing," Miss Marple said, pouring her own tea with the unhurried precision of a woman who had rehearsed this conversation a great many times in the quiet of her own thoughts, though she allowed none of that rehearsal to show in her voice. "Only I was reading through the record of the meeting held the Thursday of poor Eleanor's tea party. The Finance Committee, I believe, met that same afternoon, and I noticed the time recorded for its commencement had been corrected. A 4 altered to a 5, if I am not mistaken, in a rather careful hand. She looked up at him then over the rim of her own cup with an expression of nothing more alarming than mild, elderly puzzlement. I wondered whether you might recall which it truly was, Colonel, as I believe you chaired that meeting yourself. It was, she thought afterward, extraordinary how little a man's face need move to signal everything. The Colonel's expression did not change at all. His easy warmth remained perfectly in place, his hand steady upon his cup, and yet something behind his eyes went very still, in the particular way of a man who has just heard, in an entirely unthreatening voice, a question he has spent some weeks dreading. "I couldn't say, off the top of my head," he said, after the smallest possible pause. "One doesn't generally note the precise minute these things begin. I dare say the correction was simply Finch's carelessness. He's not the tidiest record-keeper, whatever his other virtues." "No doubt," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, and set down her cup and reached, with the unhurried deliberation of a woman drawing a shawl closer against a chill, for the small envelope she had left waiting upon the side table. "Only it is curious, Colonel, how many small things have troubled me since that dreadful afternoon. The scent of pipe tobacco in a room where poor Eleanor never once permitted smoking. And you were, I recall, the only gentleman present that day who smokes a pipe at all. The very generous gift, made to the Ash Scholarship Fund, in your own hand, in the very week Eleanor came home, after so many years away. A hand I have since found, Colonel, in a parish register some 30 years old, correcting an entry concerning a girl's death that I understand you knew rather better than the rest of the village supposed." She did not raise her voice. She had never, in the whole course of a long life, spent gently unmasking other people's carefully kept secrets, found it necessary to raise her voice, and she did not raise it now, though the silence that followed her words seemed, in that small firelit room, very much louder than shouting would have been. The Colonel set down his cup with exaggerated care, as though it had grown suddenly very heavy in his hand, and when he spoke again his voice had changed, not broken, not yet, but shifted, the warm paternal geniality, thinning like frost, beginning to give way beneath a rising sun, revealing beneath it something colder and considerably more tired than anything Miss Marple had yet heard from him. "You are asking a great many questions, Miss Marple, about a very old and very sad piece of village history." "I am asking them," she said gently, "because I do not believe Eleanor summoned you and the others to that house in order to accuse anyone, Colonel. I believe she summoned you to forgive you. I found a letter, you see, addressed to you, in her own hand, begun and never finished, never sent. 'My dear Gerald,' it said, and further on, before the fire took the rest of it, 'Forgive him,' before it." She paused, watching his face with the same quiet, unwavering attention she had given it at the tea-table, at the charity supper, at every encounter since. "Margaret was 15, Colonel. Eleanor only wanted to help you carry it, not to add to the weight of it." The teacup slipped from his hand. It did not shatter dramatically, as such things do in the more sensational sort of story. It merely tilted, slowly, as his fingers lost their careful grip upon it, and fell the short distance to the hearthrug, where it struck the fender instead, and broke cleanly in two, the tea spreading in a small dark stain across the wool. And the sound of it in that quiet room seemed to Miss Marple, watching the Colonel's face crumple at last from beneath its long-held composure into something raw and unguarded and terribly old, louder by far than any confession spoken aloud could possibly have been. He did not speak for a long moment. He sat with his hands, now empty, resting upon his knees, staring down at the broken china as though it were the only thing in the room he could bear to look at. And when at last he lifted his eyes to Miss Marple's, she saw in them not the calm, unshakable composure of the man who had knelt to retrieve a child's dropped fork at the charity supper, but something closer to what she imagined a drowning man might feel, 30 years too late, finally permitted to stop swimming. She wasn't going to tell them, he said, very quietly, more to himself, it seemed, than to her. Was she? She wasn't going to tell any of them at all. No, Colonel, Miss Marple said, and found, to her own quiet sorrow, that she meant the gentleness in her voice entirely. I don't believe she was. Chapter 10. The Weight of Forgiveness. For a long while after the cup broke, neither of them spoke. The fire settled in the grate with a small collapse of ash, and the stain of spilled tea spread slowly across the hearthrug, and Colonel Gerald Pembridge sat with his hands upon his knees and his eyes fixed upon that small ruin of china, as though it were the last steady thing left to him in a world that had, in the space of a single quiet sentence, come entirely undone. It was Miss Marple who broke the silence at last, and she did so not with a question, but with a gentleness that seemed, in that moment, to cost her a very great deal. I think you had better tell me, Colonel, she said, from the beginning, not for my sake. I believe I have understood the greater part of it already. But I think, perhaps, you have never once told it properly, from beginning to end, to another living soul. And I think, whatever comes after this afternoon, you have earned the right to be heard, at least, before you are judged. He was quiet for a long moment more. When he spoke, his voice had lost entirely the warm, unhurried cadence she had known for so many years, and what remained beneath it was older, rawer, the voice, she thought, of the young man he had once been, 30 summers gone, before 3 decades of careful goodness had grown up over him like ivy over a ruin. It was an August evening, he said. We were none of us more than children, really, though we thought ourselves very grown. There had been drink taken, more than there ought to have been, and Margaret was there, following after us the way younger girls do, wanting so badly to be thought one of the set. I don't recall now what began it. Some foolish dare, some cruelty dressed up as a joke, the sort of thing that seems at 19 no more than high spirits, and seems 40 years on like the whole of one's damnation. His hands had begun, she noticed, to tremble in his lap. I pushed her. Not hard. God knows, not hard enough. I told myself for 30 years, to account for what came after, only to frighten her, only to make the others laugh. And she went into the water, and the water there is deeper than it looks, deeper and colder, and she did not come up again." He stopped. Miss Marple said nothing, only waited, her hands folded quietly in her lap, and after a moment he continued, in the flattened, exhausted voice of a man setting down a burden too heavy to have carried so far. "We panicked, all of us. Eleanor most of all, I think, though she was the one who kept her head. In the end, it was she who insisted we say nothing, that it had been an accident, that no good could come of ruining 5 young lives to explain what could not, in any case, be undone. I believed her, because I wanted to believe her. I have gone on believing her, in one fashion or another, for 30 years. He looked up at last, and his eyes, meeting Miss Marple's, held nothing now of the composure he had worn so carefully for so long. "I told myself I would spend my life making it right, not through confession. I hadn't the courage for that, not then, and I am ashamed to say I never entirely found it since, but through decency, through kindness, given wherever I could give it. I thought, if I did enough good in the world, it might one day balance against the one unforgivable thing I had done. I have been trying to pay a debt for 30 years, Miss Marple, and I never once let myself believe it could simply be forgiven instead. I think I no longer knew how. And when Eleanor came home, Miss Marple said gently, and asked you to tea, I thought she meant to expose me." His voice cracked, very slightly on the word. "Her letter said only that she wished to set an old matter right, and I have lived 30 years dreading exactly such a letter, Miss Marple, so that when it came at last, I could read nothing in it but threat. I went to Larkspur Cottage the afternoon before the party, to speak with her privately, to beg her. I hardly know what I meant to beg. Silence, perhaps, mercy, though I did not call it that. And she took my hands, and she told me she had brought us all together, not to punish me, but to release me, to help me tell the truth at last, together, so that I need not carry it alone into whatever years remained to either of us. She said the tea party was meant to be the beginning, not of my ruin, but of my rest." His voice failed him entirely for a moment, and when he found it again, it had dropped almost to a whisper. And I could not believe her. "That is the whole of it, Miss Marple. 30 years of guilt had taught me to hear a threat in everything, even in mercy, even in the gentlest voice I have ever known, offering me exactly what I had spent half a lifetime praying, in some silent, unacknowledged corner of myself, that I might one day receive." I went back that evening while she sat alone with her tea things already laid for the next day, and I begged her once more to say nothing, and she would not out of malice, never out of malice, only out of love, though I could not hear it as love, and something in me broke that I have no words adequate to explain. Even now, even to you, I did not plan it. I want you to believe that, though I know it changes nothing. I did not walk into that room intending murder. I walked in intending only to save myself, and I have discovered, in the weeks since, that a man may do a monstrous thing without ever once deciding to. He fell silent. The fire had burned low, and the small room had grown cold around them, though neither seemed to notice it. Miss Marple regarded him for a long moment with an expression that held, in equal and uneasy measure, both a great sorrow and a great sternness. And when she spoke at last, it was with the particular gravity of a woman who had, across a very long life, learned that compassion and judgment were not, in the end, opposites, but companions that must be held together, however uncomfortably, if either was to mean very much at all. You have spent 30 years, Colonel, believing that goodness might be earned like a debt repaid, so much kindness set against so much cruelty, until the books balanced and you might at last call yourself absolved. But forgiveness was never a ledger to be settled. It was a gift, freely given, and Eleanor Voss tried to give it to you the only way she knew how, gently, privately, without judgment, asking nothing of you in return but the courage to accept it. You could not accept it because you had spent so long believing yourself unworthy of anything but punishment that mercy itself had come to sound in your ear like the cruelest threat of all. She paused, and her voice, when she continued, had softened, though it lost none of its weight. That is the tragedy of it, Colonel. Not merely that a girl died 30 years ago, in a moment of foolish cruelty you have spent your whole life regretting, but that the one person willing, at the very end, to help you set down that burden was the person you destroyed rather than believe her. He wept then, not loudly, not with any of the theater such moments so often demand in the telling, but quietly, an old man's grief, worn and private, and entirely without pretense, the tears of a man who had, for the first time in 30 years, allowed himself to be seen exactly as he was, without the careful architecture of respectability he had built to stand between himself and his own reflection. Miss Marple did not comfort him, for she understood that some griefs must be permitted to run their full course before comfort can mean anything at all. But she did not look away from him either, and sat with him in his weeping as she had sat, that first Thursday, with 5 frightened people in a locked and airless room, patient and watchful, and entirely, unflinchingly present. It was Inspector Slack, summoned by a brief note Miss Marple had left with young Constable Paulk before the Colonel's arrival, who came for him at last as the last light failed outside her small window, and Colonel Pembridge rose to meet the constables with a dignity that seemed, to Miss Marple watching from her doorway, both entirely genuine and entirely inadequate to the moment it was meant to answer, the same quiet, upright bearing he had carried across 30 years of village life, now walking, at last, toward the only reckoning that bearing had never been sufficient to prevent. He paused at her gate, as he had paused at Eleanor's a lifetime before, and turned back to look at her with an expression she would carry with her, she suspected, for whatever years remained to her own life. "Thank you," he said, "for hearing it. Whatever else you must now do." She watched him go down the lane between the constables, past the curtains that twitched at every cottage window as the village learned, in the particular hushed and horrified way villages always learn such things, precisely what manner of man had lived so long and so gently among them, and she felt no triumph in the watching, only a great and settled sorrow, the kind that does not lessen with time so much as simply take up permanent residence somewhere close beside the heart. It was some days later, once the worst of the village's shock had begun to settle into the quieter business of grief and reckoning, that Miss Marple walked once more along the overgrown path to the mill pond, carrying with her a small posy of her own late-blooming asters, and knelt, with the same effort and the same care Eleanor Voss had shown across so many private, unwitnessed years, to lay them beside the flowers already wilting there. She thought, kneeling in the failing afternoon light beside the still, dark water that had taken Margaret Ashe 30 years before, and had, in its own slow and terrible fashion, taken Eleanor Voss as well, of all the small truths this business had laid bare to her. That guilt concealed does not heal, but calcifies, and grows, in time, monstrous enough to demand a second sacrifice to protect the memory of the first. That respectability is no sure guide to innocence, and that the gentlest hands in a village may yet have done the cruelest things, not from wickedness, but from a fear so old it had forgotten its own name. That mercy offered too late, to a heart too long accustomed to punishment, may be mistaken for the very violence it was meant to end. And that redemption, if it is to mean anything at all, cannot be built quietly, brick by careful brick, out of a lifetime's unspoken atonement. It must, in the end, be spoken aloud, however much it costs the speaker, for a secret kept is a wound that never closes, no matter how much kindness is laid over it, like a bandage grown, at last, indistinguishable from the flesh beneath. She rose at last with the slow deliberation of a woman who had grown, across one quiet autumn, rather more tired than her years alone could account for, and stood for a long moment looking out across the still water, where the last of the light lay gold and fading upon its surface. "Rest now, my dears," she said softly, to no one who could hear her, or perhaps to everyone who might. "You have both, I think, carried it long enough." And she turned and walked back along the narrowing path toward the village, where the lamps were beginning to be lit in cottage windows against the gathering dark, and where the small, ordinary business of life, the kettle set to boil, the supper laid, the quiet forgiveness of small daily failings that makes any village bearable to live in at all, would go on, as it always did, whatever griefs, however old, however carefully hidden, lay buried beneath its calm and unremarkable surface.